Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sare, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate against Chuck Schumer. And you can see from the events unfolding in the last hours the looming danger of a confrontation with Russia, in which Ukraine just happens to be the choice of object. Is getting near, and this is why I need to be in the US Senate and Chuck Schumer does not. He is the majority leader of the Senate, and he has had absolutely nothing to say about the insane series of developments that are leading us to the point where the President of the United States would hold a press conference today where he says that he is, quote unquote, convinced that President Vladimir Putin has decided to invade Ukraine. And when the reporters ask him for the evidence of this, he simply says, "We have reason to believe that in the coming days." Now, we've been hearing this for actually since November of last year. As of this point, Russia has not invaded Ukraine, but we have a situation now where there are escalating tensions and some explosions in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. These are sort of autonomous republics which broke away from Ukraine after the coup of 2013, 2014, when the Obama administration spent $5 billion through the National Endowment for Democracy, which, as I've said before, is a front group for the CIA, to overthrow the elected government of Ukraine and bring in a regime very sympathetic to the fascist Stepan Bandera. The current president, Zelensky, I believe, would be inclined to be more moderate, but the extremist elements in his own nation will overthrow him if he is, and the United States and the British, and particularly the British, have something else in mind. Now, what has happened is that the leaders of Donetsk and Lugansk are evacuating 700,000 people from the eastern part of Ukraine. So tell me, if Putin, the evil Russian, is going to invade Ukraine, why would the pro-Russian elements be leaving? And in fact, where are they going? They're evacuating Ukraine into Russia for their own protection. So that makes no sense. What the media has neglected to tell you is that there are over 100,000 troops of the Kiev regime on the borders of the Donbass. That's the region of this Russian ethnic population. And these troops actually have been shelling eastern Ukraine for the last 7 years. That's what the Minsk Accord is about. I bet many of my viewers didn't know that either. So it's lie upon lie upon lie. Why? Well, you saw in the thumbnail for this program the triple curve function of LaRouche. It looks like a trumpet bell with one curve going up hyperbolically, another, actually two curves going up hyperbolically on top, one going hyperbolically down. What does that represent? That represents the time since Nixon's decision under the terrible counsel of George Shultz and pressure from the British to decouple the dollar from the gold reserve system, allowing floating exchange rates and massive amounts of speculation at the expense of our physical productive economy. So we are at a point where the actual physical economy, the infrastructure, the food supply chain, our healthcare system is all just a hair's breadth away from literal disintegration. But the stock market has been at all-time highs. I don't know how it's doing today with rumors of a war with Russia, and why anyone would want a war between the US and Russia, or a war between NATO and Russia. I think we should enlarge our mental hospitals to make it possible for us to put the people there who want that, although probably it's not that many, but they seem to have an awful lot of power at the moment. At any rate, we have heard this narrative. Why? Because the bubble is bursting or imploding, but you cannot continuously pump money into a speculative bubble with no production and expect that it will last forever. And I think anyone who thinks that a war is not, there's not a danger of a war, is underestimating the desperation of the City of London and Wall Street and the impending crash. The danger of war is not coming from Russia. I had posted something on Facebook earlier where I said that, as the Russians were saying, this is a well-known script. Biden is going to say that Putin's going to invade, then the United States will threaten terrible sanctions and other actions, then Putin will not invade, then Biden will say, you see, the threat of sanctions caused them to back down. Back down from what? Doing something they never intended to do. But the fact that you have 700,000 people now being evacuated from eastern Ukraine into Russia, first of all, if they're moving in that direction, doesn't that imply that the feared assault is coming from within Ukraine toward Russia? Now, if this still leaves you in doubt, I'm going to read you something which is, I think, a good introduction to the clips from Lyndon LaRouche that we are going to hear tonight. As I have said, I had the privilege and honor of working with Lyndon LaRouche from 1987, 1988 until his death in 2019. So about 33 years. He was an unbelievable genius, a real American patriot who had in his veins the idea, the noble idea of what the United States was to represent, as clearly as John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, President Kennedy, Alexander Hamilton, Martin Luther King, all of these figures who understood the revolutionary nature of the United States is not our religion or our geography or even our language. The revolutionary nature of the United States is the conception that every human being is created equally in the image of the Creator and has a divine potential whose obligation it is for the government to protect that. That is to promote the general welfare, to protect the potential of every human being to become a genius. And thereby, people are worthy of self-government because no one is superior to someone else by virtue of their bloodline or their income or something else. To subvert such a republic, you have to destroy the culture and you have to destroy the identity of the nation. That is the assault that has been ongoing. It started in full force in the 60s, although began really earlier. But the infamous rock, drug, sex counterculture, the 4 assassinations of the Kennedys, the 2 Kennedys, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, the Vietnam War, created a shift in the United States where we lost our optimism and our commitment, our selfless commitment to goodness as a nation. But if you talk to the American people, that quality is still there, which is why even at this perilous moment, I believe that the nation can be saved and why we can cause our nation to turn from its very destructive ways. But let me just read you something from the White House from January 25th. I don't know who the speakers were. It was not Biden, but some spokesman for the White House who said, quote, "The goal is to hit Putin's strategic ambitions to industrialize his economy quite hard, to undercut Putin's aspirations to exert influence on the world stage. We're talking about denying to Russia downstream products that are critical to its own ambitions to develop high-tech capabilities in aerospace and defense, lasers and sensors, maritime, AI, robotics, quantum, etc. And so, as we build this effort with our allies and partners, we're willing to work with any country in order to deny Russia an input that it needs to diversify its economy." Now, since when was it the mission of the United States to crush the aspirations of another nation? Is that what we did to even Germany after World War II? Is that what Douglas MacArthur did to Japan? Does it say that in our Declaration of Independence or our Constitution? We will be number one because we will crush everybody else. So even though we have record suicides and record drug overdoses and our infrastructure is falling apart and people are flooding, dying in floods in their basements and burning in fires in the Bronx, at least we can make sure everyone else has it worse off than we do. I don't think that's the mission of the United States. I think most Americans would agree with me that this is not the mission of the United States. If we have people in the White House that are claiming that this is our objective, then they need to be removed and we need to return to our senses. So with that, what I would like to do is to show you a couple of clips of Lyndon LaRouche, which will give you an idea of why he was so feared and hated by these people. The first is an excerpt from a speech he gave on the question of manifest destiny, but in it, he really gets at what is the conception of the identity of the United States, what distinguishes us from Europe, etc. So why don't we go to that?
So in 1861 to 1876, under Lincoln's leadership and his followers, immediate followers, the United States emerged as the most powerful single economy in the world, the most advanced technologically, not necessarily the most advanced scientifically, but the most advanced technologically. Our level of technology was a model so that by 1876, 1877, the entire world was looking to the United States as the model to be emulated. Russia adopted the model of the Americas. We had Mendeleev, who was at the 1876 Philadelphia celebration of the centennial of the founding of the United States. He went back to Russia and he built the Trans-Siberian Railroad. You had developments in Germany. Germany in 1877 changed its policy fundamentally. So the German economic policy was a copy of the American economic policy. Japan in the 1870s adopted the American model of Henry Carey, and Henry Carey directly had a hand in directing Japan in doing that, to lay the foundations of what became the economic successes in Japan. Yeah? The same thing happened with Sun Yat-sen at a later point. Sun Yat-sen was a Chinese who was educated in Hawaii. While educated in Hawaii, he became the future founder of the nation of China as a republic. He was backed by the Americans. He was hated by the British and persecuted by the British. But if you look at the plans for the development of China by Sun Yat-sen in a book which is published, which we published a copy of this book, even in China, get it back translated into Chinese for the benefit of the Chinese. His model for the development of China was the model of the United States, the model of 1861, 1876, the American model. So in this period, there came a great debate, a debate between the patriots and traitors of the United States, particularly of the latter part of the century. The patriots of the United States looked at the Pacific Ocean and said, in continuation of the ideas of Cusa, that we must go across the Pacific to help the nations of Asia develop. And they understood something more about this. They understood that the culture of European civilization, when we speak of European civilization, we're talking about essentially a Greek-founded or classical Greek foundation for European civilization in all its achievements. So it was a Christian matrix imposed upon the Greek classical model. This was the model upon which our Constitution was based, our laws. This is our difference between us and the British laws and the British traditions. That we recognize that we dealt in the world with other cultures, the culture of China, the culture of India, that we, being the products of European Christian civilization, must find our way to come to an ecumenical agreement and cooperation with people of other cultures in other parts of the world. And the great drive and the great debate in the last part of the 19th century between the patriots on the one side, like Blaine from Maine, who was Secretary of State for a while, who was an associate of President Garfield, an associate of the great heroes of our nation in that period, had this conception: we must go across the Pacific to establish an ecumenical relationship and bond with the peoples on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, to develop the world as a whole for our common benefit. And we must reach out to other nations. What was the other idea here? That because of problems in Europe, and of course I have a great deal to do with Europe personally, I know a good deal about it. I have a wife who beats me if I don't learn enough about it. But in any case, if you look at European governments and European political systems, the political systems of Europe are at their best inferior to the form of government which we established here in the United States with our Constitution. What's the difference? We have, our head of state is an elected president. There is no person under our law, of course the Congress doesn't obey the law too well these days, but there's no person under our law who has greater authority in the state as a person, as an elected official, than the President of the United States. That is the characteristic of our Constitution.
So I think you hear something from him about the conception of the United States. What I'm going to go to now is a lengthier clip, about just under half an hour, from a speech that Lyndon LaRouche gave in 2001, just after the very tragic sinking of the Russian submarine, the Kursk, which probably was in a collision with a NATO submarine. All 118 sailors aboard died. Apparently 23 of them managed to get into a compartment, but they could not rescue them in time. It was a horrible tragedy. Putin had to take extraordinary leadership of Russia at the time also to avert extreme tension with NATO and with the United States, because many people believe that this perhaps had occurred deliberately. So when you're looking at President Putin, you are not looking at any ordinary leader. There are many times when he has acted to prevent situations from escalating, like people may remember when Obama was about to launch strikes on Syria, and Putin proposed, why don't we work out an agreement where the chemical weapons can be removed from Syria and we can verify that and get observers, which was done. So these kind of actions have been extremely significant. What LaRouche does here is he begins with that moment, warning of the danger, which I would say is reminiscent of the situation today, but I think today is much more dangerous because, frankly, the culture in the United States has degenerated in the transatlantic world. And in the UK, the British intelligence agencies, which have largely been pulling the strings on this thing, the level of morality is much lower. The level of sanity is much more questionable. So therefore, I think the situation is more, and the financial system is nearer its total disintegration. So the situation is more dangerous. That is not to say it is hopeless. There are very important moves like the recent declaration signed by Russia and China, which paves the way for a new order among nation states, where they assert that no nations should enter into security agreements that in any way infringes on that negatively impacts the security of any other nation. In other words, you hear an echo of the Treaty of Westphalia, that nations must act in the interest of the other. And put behind in Westphalia, they had to draw a line and simply say, no revenge. We are not looking back. We're not getting even. So many people have blood on their hands. We're going to move forward and we're going to act in the interest of the other. The fact that two major powers have come to such an agreement, I think, indicates a pathway whereby these things can be resolved. unfortunately, thanks to the criminal news media in the United States, most Americans are entirely unaware of this discussion. And one thing I just want to add before we get to this, but I have to say it, is we have a situation in Afghanistan right now where 7 million children are on the brink of starvation, 1 million in such a condition as they would be in the intensive care unit if they were in a Western country. The Biden administration froze their funds in the New York Federal Reserve. Then he's taken that money from the New York Federal Reserve, $7 billion. $3.5 billion is going to the 9/11 families. The problem is, one, you're taking it from children who are starving, who were not even born when 9 occurred. Two, it further obscures the truth, because what the 9/11 families want is justice. They are pursuing Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is still considered a great ally, even though you might observe that the policies of their government are not a whole lot different than that of the Taliban. So in one case, we're exterminating an entire population through starvation. In another case, they're considered a great ally. So this theft of that 3.5 billion was not helpful. And the other 3.5 billion, Biden is not giving to the Afghan central bank where it belongs, but is giving it to as yet undisclosed relief agencies. We don't know what they are. We don't know how the relief is going to be delivered. This is a complete violation of the sovereignty of Afghanistan. Now, what LaRouche does here is he begins with the danger of the current situation in 2000 with the sinking of the Russian submarine, but he unfolds it in a very beautiful way through, and it's an amazing history course in 28 minutes. He goes through many of the presidencies of the United States, the individual presidents, what their role was, the role of the British, how we got into World War I, how we got into World War II, etc. It's an amazing sweep. So I would urge you to hold on to your seats, get your notebooks out when you listen to this, and then that will be followed by some other clips from Lyndon LaRouche. And this will be the last that you're hearing from me tonight. But definitely pay attention to the next at least 28 minutes, better an hour, because you will find yourself quite inspired and uplifted. And we really need that in order to navigate the crisis we're currently in.
Thank you. Thank you. On the 12th of October, August, a Saturday, a Russian major vessel, a submarine, the Kursk, was sunk in the Barents Sea. Some hours later, the location of the sunken submarine was located, and in the following hours, the president of Russia, President Vladimir Putin, telephoned the president of the United States, Bill Clinton. They met by phone. There were discussions with the respective military groups, advisors on both sides. The two presidents discussed, and thermonuclear World War III was avoided. That's the fact of the matter, the essential fact. Now, this situation, which still continues, a continued and escalating threat of thermonuclear and other war, now spreading about the planet, is a condition which I addressed a little more than 11 months ago in a film which was produced in this country in October of last year, and just to see the beginning of it at this point. what you're seeing is a war in the North Caucasus region on southern Russia. What you're also seeing is a war which is broken out simultaneously in the border between Pakistan and India. The forces behind these attacks on Russia and on India are the same. They are a mercenary force which was first set into motion by policies adopted at a trilateral commission meeting in Kyoto, Japan in 1975. Policies originally of Brzezinski and his number 2 man there, Samuel P. Huntington. The policies which were continued by then Trilateral Commission member, that is back in 1975, George Bush, before he became vice president. These are policies which were continued by George Bush as vice president. This is under Bush, became known as the Iran-Contra drug finance link operations of mercenaries deployed with private funding all over the world, recruited from Islamic and other countries, and targeting Russia's flank. In that film, I did not, of course, indicate the sinking of the Kursk, and though I did, the crisis associated with the sinking of the Kursk, which if Bush had been president, or George W. Bush Jr. had been president, would probably have led immediately to World War III. So obviously you don't want George Bush for president at this time, under those conditions. But what I forecast was a condition which already existed, a condition which in the later part of the films I indicated would continue, has continued, would worsen, had worsened, and we are still headed toward some kind of catastrophe which could be thermonuclear World War III or something equally bad. And there are things which are equally bad. The point is that what has happened now was the inevitable consequence of policies to which I referred then. Policies which have a deep root in U.S. foreign policy from the 1970s. These were the policies of the Carter administration. These were the Bush policies of the Reagan administration, as far as Bush was running part of the show then. These were the policies of the Bush administration. These have been the policies of the United States government under the Clinton and Gore administration. Continued. Clinton may have objected to this. Clinton may have acted this recently to prevent this from becoming an aggravated crisis in conjunction with President Vladimir Putin. But Clinton has done nothing to lessen the danger of this global warfare. If Gore were to become president or Bush, war or similar kinds of global catastrophe would be inevitable. That's the problem we face, because the policy structure which is in place in the United States and generally in the world today ensures a drive of civilization toward a collapse, worse on a global scale than the New Dark Age which struck Europe during the middle of the 14th century. Now, contrary to some people, you don't bet on wars. You don't go to your bookie and say, I want to make a bet on whether war breaks out or not. War is not an event. A condition like the sinking of the Kursk is not an isolated event. This was not an incident. There was not a Kursk incident that provoked a crisis. There was a crisis in which the sinking of the Kursk occurred, a strategic crisis. There was a response to the crisis. There was a response by two presidents, that of Russia and the United States, to the accentuation of the crisis associated with the sinking of the Kursk. But do not speak of a Kursk incident. History doesn't work that way. World War I, for example. World War I began in 1863, 1865. It began after the Battle of Gettysburg, in which it became apparent to people in Europe, including England, that the Confederacy was going to be defeated by the continued determination on the part of the President of the United States to crush and destroy the Confederacy. At that point, the British monarchy, which was then and is now still the mortal enemy of the United States, for reasons I shall explain, the British monarchy had a queen, Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria had a son, who was later known as King Edward VII. Not long after the end of the Civil War, the husband of the Queen died. Queen Victoria, who was not particularly a mental giant or an emotional or moral giant, went into a state of crisis. She went up to Scotland, had an affair with a man up there, and spent a good deal of the time amusing herself on drugs. The records of the local pharmacy next to the castle up there indicated there were some very strange goings-on at the castle when the Queen was in attendance. Increasingly, when the Queen is in this depraved condition, that's why she was called Queen Victoria. She conquered depravity and made herself the empress of it. But her son, the Prince of Wales, actually acted as the monarch of the British Empire. And the British Empire wished to destroy the United States. But first, realizing they could not conquer the United States by means of war or by civil war, they resorted to other means. And the first means was to isolate and attempt to destroy the United States in its influence globally. Because the success of the United States, not only in defeating the British puppet, the Confederacy, and these were nothing but British puppets, and by launching a great industrial revolution worldwide, which began in the United States in 1861 and reached a high point in 1876, the United States was recognized worldwide as a leading world power, as the most powerful of individual nation states on this planet economically, the most advanced technologically in terms of production of any nation on this planet, and nations began to imitate the United States. From that, about 1875-76, Germany, which already had close relations with the United States, began to adopt, under Bismarck, some of the policies of the United States. And Germany began its great industrial revolution in 1877, modeled upon the United States. In the same period of time, a Russian, Mendeleev, the great Dmitry Mendeleev, the great scientist, also brought back to Russia, with the association with his Tsar, Alexander II, the attempt to implement the economic policies of the United States in Russia. Similar developments occurred in France, related, different. Japan, in the same period, adopted the United States as a model for the development of the economy of Japan. A friend of Carey's, the economist who advised Lincoln and who helped to create Lincoln as a political figure, Henry C. Carey, sent his representatives to Japan, E. Peshine Smith, to educate the Japanese imperial circles on how to create an economy. The development of the economy of Japan from that time to the present time as an agro-industrial power is entirely the result of the influence of the United States and the Lincoln legacy upon the economic development of Japan. Other countries joined as well. There was, as a result of this, a revival and a direct influence of the North American model, the model of the Lincoln model, throughout South and Central America. It was during the latter part of the 19th century that most all the progressive forces, economically progressive forces and politically progressive forces in Mexico South to Argentina adopted the United States model, the so-called Hamilton-Carey-List model as the policy for national economic development of their country. And that generally continued until 1901, until the assassination of McKinley by the friends of Teddy Roosevelt, then vice president, sort of the George Bush of that period, who changed U.S. policies. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was an asset, President Teddy Roosevelt was an asset of the King of England, because by that time Victoria had finally gotten around and found her way to dying, and thus finally her son, the Prince of Wales, had become the monarch. So Teddy Roosevelt was a puppet of the British monarch, Prince Edward VII. Prince Edward VII was out to destroy the power and influence of the United States globally by putting the nations of Eurasia, which had been attuned to the United States in its policy, by turning them against each other. This became known as World War I. Japan, for example, in the 1890s, which had been a friend of the United States, was taken over by the British monarchy. And the British, under the British instructions and British direction, Japan launched the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894-1895. Under British direction, as an anti-American move, the Japanese later launched a second war against the interests of China, the second Sino-Japanese War. In the meantime, the Japan war against Russia, which was organized also from London, directly with a British agent on the scene to help the process along, was used as a stunt to get Russia into the hands of those who were against the United States, who were willing to join the British and French in a war against Germany. And Japan, of course, took the side of the British in World War I. And that's how we got World War I. This was made possible because the President of the United States in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt, the man who rose to position by accession by assassination, was a tool of the British, and because Roosevelt's designated successor, Ku Klux Klan enthusiast Woodrow Wilson, the man who launched the second birth of the Ku Klux Klan from the White House officially and openly, a great Democrat of the type we know, was on the side of the British. And if the British had not had the Americans on their side for World War I, Britain would have lost World War I. So at that time, we had the emergence of the Woodrow Wilson, the Teddy Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson tradition, which took over control of the United States effectively until Franklin Roosevelt. And once we got rid of Franklin Roosevelt by death, then the British were able to triumph and get the United States again back as a puppet of London, which the United States has been essentially to the present time. The importance of this in terms of the strategic situation is the issue then and now, and in the time of the American Revolution, remains the same. The British Empire, the British monarchy, was created by a rentier financier interest which consolidated its power over the English monarchy with the accession of George I as first king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. From that time on, the establishment of an independent republic in North America became the central interest and cause of all of the patriotic, Republican-minded people in Europe. As a result of this, European forces in France, especially France, in Germany, Italy, England, and so forth, united to help make the United States independence a success. The United States became an independent republic only because of European direction and support for this cause. The intent of the Europeans up until the French Revolution, and even at the beginning of the French Revolution, was that France would become the second nation state modeled as a state upon the policies of the United States as expressed by the Declaration of Independence and the Federal Constitution. The Jacobin Terror of 1789, that is from the 14th of July, 1789, until the beheading of Robespierre and Saint-Just 5 years later. The Jacobin Terror demoralized Europe and isolated the United States, which no longer had friends in Europe, or these significant nation-state friends. And thus, the United States was isolated. The United States recovered from this isolation with the victory of the United States under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln over a British puppet, the Confederacy, an institution which, like the French Jacobin Terror, had been orchestrated from London. Specifically, in the case of the Jacobin Terror, the Jacobin Terror was organized in France on the direction of the first head of the British Foreign Office's Secret Intelligence Service, the Secret Committee, by Jeremy Bentham. And all of the leaders of the 5 years of the French Terror, the Jacobin Terror in France, were operating under the personal direction of the head of the British Foreign Office Intelligence Service, Jeremy Bentham. The purpose was to destroy the chief ally of the United States, France at that time, to prevent it from coming back as what it had been before, and so forth. Once, after the War of 1812, the chief effort was Britain was to destroy the United States from within. To this purpose, traitors in the United States, centered in Wall Street and similar locations, organized what became known as the Confederate Conspiracy. You had President Andy Jackson was a traitor. So was President Polk, a traitor. Both great Democratic, these were the founders of the Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren was the puppet master in charge of the traitor Andy Jackson. Polk was a British agent. President Pierce, another good Democrat, was a British agent. President Buchanan was a British agent. These were the people who, with Polk's initiative, organized and prepared the military conspiracy which became known as the Confederacy. The United States war against the Confederacy was a war to defend not only the United States, not only the Constitution, not only to eliminate the slavery institution. It was a war to defend upon this planet the right of a republic to exist, free of the domination of the British Empire and the British monarchy. That was the great world cause, the cause of all humanity, for which the greatest war ever fought by the United States, the Civil War, was fought, led by Lincoln. The defeat of the Confederacy was the defeat of the British Empire, a change in the strategic situation, and the bringing back to European civilization of the hope of a form of society free of control by the kind of oligarchy which then and now has been represented worldwide chiefly by the British monarchy and by the bankers, the financiers of the City of London, and by the British Empire. The British Empire always was and remains to this day the chief enemy of all civilization and of the United States in particular. So therefore, the power of the United States, achieved through the victory of Lincoln over the Confederacy and over the British, became the chief thing which the British were determined to eliminate, going first at the admirers of the United States by organizing what became World War I. The United States became a patsy, in that a tool and instrument of the British Empire in World War I. Franklin Roosevelt, changed that. Franklin Roosevelt was a patriot of a patriotic family tradition who moved to restore the United States step by step toward what it had become. Roosevelt became the indispensable ally of the British for its survival against Hitler, the Hitler the British put into power in the first place. But Roosevelt was the greatest threat to the British Empire once the war had been won. Unfortunately, at that point, he was dead, and Truman was a stooge. Because what was Roosevelt's policy? Why did the British wish to be rid of Roosevelt? Why did the British spend the past period since the death of Roosevelt trying, among other things, to destroy the United States the way we are half destroyed today? Why? What's the issue? What underlies this whole history leading up to this so-called Kursk incident near brush with thermonuclear war, which occurred on the period of October 12th through 13th and 14th? What's the problem? Point is, Roosevelt's policy was that once the war had ended, World War II, once the Nazis had been defeated, that the policy of the United States was that the power of the United States would be to break up all relics of the Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French empires, and to cause to come standing in the place of the former victims of colonialism, of British imperialism, because all these empires were run by the British at that time. The Portuguese were stooges for the British. The Dutch were stooges for the British. The French were stooges for the British. Roosevelt was going to crush it all and use the power of the United States at the end of the war to bring this about. And where former colonies had existed, there were to be independent republics established. And the United States, as Roosevelt laid this out to Churchill at Casablanca for the case of Africa, the United States would use its technology and power not only to bring about the freedom of the victims of British imperialism, but also to give these countries the means, the newly freed countries, the means to stand on their own feet economically with U.S. cooperation in infrastructure and technology. In other words, what Roosevelt intended was that the former victims, or the victims of British imperialism, would have the same benefits which the United States brought to Western continental Europe, to Western Europe, with programs such as the original IMF, the original Bretton Woods Agreement, and with the Marshall Plan later. Therefore, that would mean the end of the British Empire, would have meant the end of the power of the London fakers and of the Wall Street gang as well, who were simply part of the allies of the British financier oligarchy. Would have been meant at the end of the British monarchy and everything it stood for. And a world consistent with the intentions of the founders of the United States as a republic, a world consistent with the intentions for which Abraham Lincoln had led the nation in defeat of the Confederacy. Thus, the first thing to understand, if you're going to make sense of the modern world, of the past 3 centuries of history and longer, you have to understand that the fundamental issue since the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the fundamental strategic issue on this planet has been 2 policies. The policy of the British Empire against the policy embedded in the Declaration of Independence and in the Federal Constitution, especially the preamble. That's the issue. Any other interpretation of history or major events is nonsense. And that's what people were going to have to learn. So when you understand what's going on in Russia, the Kursk incident, and things of that sort, the danger of a thermonuclear war, which occurred this past month. To understand that, you have to go to the fundamental conflict between the British monarchy and the fundamental interests of the Constitution and people of the United States.
Okay, Lynn, I was quite struck by the discussion you had this afternoon on the idea of the embedded in the U.S. Constitution, how it came forward with Lincoln, and how that affected the World War II generation, and then how that resonated again through FDR and was at the center of the civil rights movement. And of course, many baby boomers think that the civil rights movement was the victory of the baby boomers, the golden generation, and so on. And of course, we know that's not the case. But what's interesting to me is with the discussion you've had of the effect of the Truman Depression and the collapse of morality from the World War II generation coming home after the war to the immorality that created the baby boomers. And yet, it was your generation which was responsible for a moral reawakening with the civil rights movement. Now, as we look around today, there are many supporters of you and our movement who are somewhat cynical that we can move the baby boom generation and Generation X. But I think that having come through the McCarthy period, the Eisenhower administration, and then being mobilized for the civil rights movement gives some example of the kind of leadership. And given that this is the weekend of Dr. Martin Luther King and that you've spoken about this quite a bit, I wonder if you can take that to discuss a little bit this question of the kind of leadership that's required of us today.
As I said yesterday in the discussion of the same matter, that on the question of Christianity, which is what the issue is here, on the principles on which the United States is founded, that one should not speak according to what one is taught to say as doctrine. Above all, in such matters, one should speak the truth. And above all, to speak the truth, you must speak truthfully. You must not claim to know anything you don't know. And therefore, the fact that someone has taught you or you believe it is correct doctrine is no grounds for saying anything important on any important subject. If you learned it at college, it's not legitimate to say it, especially these days. Now, on the question of, is man made in the image of God? I can say with certainty that I know that. I can say with certainty that I know that every man and woman is made in the image of God. I can prove it. It's a scientific fact. Right? Now, therefore, the question is to understand the Constitution, you have to understand a number of people. Among the people most important to understand is Gottfried Leibniz, who, in a sense, was my mentor from my 14th year of age. Now, how do I know this? And I defy anybody to say the contrary, and I will say it's untrue. Because of what I described today, cognition. That cognition is a power which resides in every person if we develop it. Cognition is a power which every person has if they are developed. Cognition is associated with a passion, which Plato calls a passion for truth, which the Apostle Paul in places such as 1 Corinthians 13 says, if you are not of this passion, that everything else you pretend to believe or do is worthless. You are empty, you are tinkling brass. What is this passion? In Greek is called agape. In the language of Plato, in the language of Paul, also in the language of the Apostle John in his Gospel. This is love. This is love of mankind. It is love of truth. It is love of justice. One's cause is that which makes the individual in the image of God. Therefore, it is impossible and immoral to teach students to learn. It is moral not to teach students to know. What they learn through cognition, they know. What they learn through words and textbooks and repetition and dutiful repetition of phrases, speak after me, they don't know. They have merely learned it. And if they say they know, they lie. And they lie above all to themselves as well as their friends. Therefore, I know all men are made in the image of God, because this power, which we recognize by a passion called in the Greek agape, is the power to discover the principles of the universe and more. And by that act of discovery, to command the universe, to obey us. Thus, when I read in Genesis first that man is made in the image of God, nothing about Adam and Eve there, man and woman are each made in the image of God to exert dominion over all living things, over this planet, over this universe. I know that's true. It's a fact of cognition. Thus, if man is of this nature, must we not have a society according to man's nature? And is it not evil to have anything in society which is contrary to man's nature? What is man's nature? Man is made in the image of God. Every baby is an angel made in the image of God with this power. It is an evil not to develop that power. It is an evil to drive that child into insanity, to oppress that child, to deprive it of nurture, to deprive it of the development of its cognitive powers, to cut it off from great art, to deprive it of a scientific education is a crime. It's a crime against humanity. And nobody loves humanity, and nobody is a Christian who denies that or allows that to occur. By this power, man rules the universe, and that is right, because this power is a godlike power. And therefore, must not society be constituted in such a way that society is provided the nurture, the assurance of the nurture, the education, the development of the cognitive powers of every child? And once we've educated the child, shall we put the child into slavery or degradation to make his suffering more acute precisely because he realizes that he's being abused? Must we not order society in such a way that it is fitting, a fitting place to live and work for the mission of that angel, which is the individual human being? Now, who knew this? Who wrote the Constitution? Well, a fellow called Gottfried Leibniz. And Gottfried Leibniz was the person who influenced, through Benjamin Franklin and his circle, who influenced and shaped the American Revolution. The most important works of Leibniz were against a man who was a true servant of the devil, John Locke. And these ideas that Leibniz expressed in this form, as they found themselves into the Declaration of Independence, were ideas that Leibniz wrote in denunciation of the evil intrinsic to British liberalism, that of the satanic John Locke. The life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness is what? Happiness is agape. Happiness is joy in being human, by expressing in the noblest degree that which is human. Happiness is seeing other people happy in this way. Is seeing joy, the light turn on in a blank face of a child. To see a child that seemed ignorant and dirty and helpless, and this child suddenly turns alive and comes alive and discovers something beautiful, science or art. That's happiness. Because you're only coming this way for one short time. And your happiness will have to be taken in how you perform your mission. As a good Samaritan in the larger sense. That is what the meaning is. Because remember, John Locke said life, liberty, and property. And property was the hallmark of slavery. John Locke was cited. John Locke was emblazoned in the Confederate Constitution. John Locke's life, liberty, and property were the defense of the peculiar institution, very peculiar, called slavery, on which the United States, by the way, lost money. The slave owners made money, the cotton manufacturers made money, but the United States lost money on it. It was not a profitable proposition, which makes it all the more evil, because it was not done for profit, it was done for evil. Evil. The people who did it were not bad, misguided, they were evil. Now Lincoln was a student of these matters, and Lincoln, by the way, was also a student of William Shakespeare. His position papers to his cabinet were generally long quotations from William Shakespeare's dramas. And some of them used to complain loudly about that. But see, Lincoln was a genius, and he knew what Shakespeare was. Booth didn't. Booth was sort of a predecessor of Sir Laurence Olivier, the man who was the British imitator of, what's his name, this American actor, Mumbles, Marlon Brando, yeah, Mumbles Brando. So he understood that in Shakespeare, taking up these Greek tragic themes was precisely the knowledge of statecraft which his cabinet needed to understand what he was going to do. So Lincoln made this policy. He revived the American Constitution in exactly the way that Martin came to understand it, as Martin expressed it clearly. You see, in order to make each of us whole, we must make other people whole. In order to find our own humanity, we must give other people their humanity. That's what angels do. You're nothing but what you do in your mission. Your mission essentially is to contribute to humanity. Now, let's take the question, the last part of the question. What about the baby boomer? The characteristic feature of the baby boomer is they don't know what love is and they don't know what happiness is. It all comes out in the midlife crisis. They feel that their sexual potency is waning, their wife no longer attracts them, and they have a midlife crisis. Because they are creatures of pleasure, not happiness. Look at their entertainment. Look at the changes in entertainment in Europe and in the United States over the period of the past 30-odd years. We had a shift from a farce, an objet d'art, as just referred to by George, where art, instead of being something in which the population was involved as a participant, and the artist was a vehicle for evoking participation from the audience, it was an object to look at, to admire, to comment on. Look at the reviews. Look at the reviews from before 1966. In any newspaper, in virtually all newspapers. Read Musical America. Read any of these publications from that period. The art was never addressed. A comment on the art. It was like, what color dress was worn to the opera by the singer? Something to that order. So we were tasters of culture, but at least we pretended to taste. Now they got bored with that after 1966, and Bob Dylan came in. And let me just describe a situation in 1968, September of 1968, which describes the situation perfectly. There's a fellow who some of us knew, Tony and I and others knew, who was a student at Columbia University, and I knew him from 1966-67 period. I knew him because I had written a pamphlet on third world issues called The Third Stage of Imperialism, which he was much attracted to at that point, and had approached me and engaged in an intelligent conversation on this subject. At a later point, he became part of the, or shall we say, he went to pot and took a trip through the acid route in between. And I saw him degenerate, and I attended a session in September of 1968, which he was addressing a typical Columbia student, undergraduate, graduate student audience. You wanted to say the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was completely coherent prose compared with this, what was going on there. This man was speaking in broken sentences, in garbled and mangled words at that. And he was getting cheers and all kinds of erotic exultation coming out of the audience. As far as I was concerned, there was no communication, about as much communication as walking a cage full of monkeys getting excited at the zoo. And yet they seemed to be pleased. Later I had an explanation. These were fragments from Bob Dylan something or others. And the very citation of little fragments from this garbage, this pig pen of language, would produce among the giggly types in the front row and so forth. But the characteristic of the baby boomer was an occupation, an obsession with pleasure. This obsession with pleasure came from their parents in a very peculiar way. The parents were, as you might suspect, of my generation. And the parents were typified by people with whom I've served in India and Burma during my overseas stint during World War II. And before we came back on the boat, and as we came back on the boat, we were pretty much of a pro-Roosevelt inclination. We had seen what the British did in their colonies. We had a smell of what happened to most of the people on this planet. And I proposed, and most people accepted the idea, that when we return to the United States, we should see to it the lost vestiges of every damned empire on this planet ought to be eliminated while we in the United States had the power to do so. Just eliminate the empires. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Portuguese Empire. Just cancel them out. And give these countries what they wanted, the chance to have access to the opportunity for development which we prized for ourselves. And I can tell you that a majority of my fellow servicemen agreed. They were inspired, they were ennobled by what Roosevelt meant in the recovery of the United States from an appalling depression and getting through the war. They came back off the boat in what I thought would be reasonably good moral condition. But within a year to two after that, I discovered the quite contrary. Truman turned the American servicemen into animals, and he had already succeeded with their wives. What had happened is remember that Roosevelt was determined to eliminate imperialism. The British turned it around with Truman, and Truman loved the British. He was a man of poor taste, you know. And so therefore we gave the British back their empire. The British got us to give the French back their empire. The Portuguese were given their empire. The Dutch were given their empire back. And we said, the big issue was Russia. So Stalin was over there, not thinking about any war, but they whomped up a good threat against the Soviet Union, and Stalin turned into a raving character. Now the big enemy is communism. So now we ally with our enemy, our age-old enemy, the Brits. And I can tell you, my fellow American, and I went to visit, the course of post-war period, old buddies and so forth, to see many of the people I served with overseas. And they had turned into animals, and their wives were worse. Don't get into trouble. Don't say what you think. Don't do what you think. We lost 5 years in the war to make up for it. We've got to build this family. We've got to get security. We've got to get that job. We've got to get this. Don't get into trouble. Don't think that. Don't say that. Don't be associated with that. They became totally immoral pigs because what they said was not premised upon what they believed to be true or truthful. It was not premised on a sense of justice. It was not premised on reality. It was premised upon that sewer pipe that leads to the cesspool of history called mainstream thinking. These were the parents of the baby boomer generation. This was the culture these families represented, especially those who sent their children to universities in the 1960s. So don't be surprised the way the baby boomers turned out on the crisis of the missile crisis. Yeah? Some of you remember what the missile crisis was like those weeks. There were a lot of lies were told about that, by the way, that should be cleaned up in due course. We've got the documentation now. The lies can be proven. The British set up Khrushchev in this one against the United States. Our dear old ever-loving British allies. Typical of them. Well, that. The shooting of Kennedy and the cover-up. And the smell of the cover-up was all over the place. People say conspiracy theory. These people are degenerates. No conspiracy theory. The facts were there. Somebody killed the president. It wasn't one guy with a pop gun. It didn't shoot straight. And there were issues involved, important issues of the highest strategic significance in eliminating Kennedy. A job done by the same people who tried to eliminate de Gaulle. Yeah? The same people, same collection of people who are running that terrorist operation in Chiapas State in Mexico today. Yeah? Same crowd. The same people who created the Sendero Luminoso terrorists in Brazil and in Peru, the narco terrorists. Yeah? So they took these pretty children who came from families who had abandoned truthfulness, who had abandoned justice, abandoned morality for the sake of being part of the mainstream that leads to the cesspool. So these children were subjected to a shock, and they had no inner moral strength. They believed in nothing because they didn't want to believe in anything. They wished to induce themselves to be perceived believing in what was considered advantageous. What we produced was a bunch of children who pretended to believe, but who believed precisely nothing, except in success and security and avoiding trouble, like drafts, like strong, cold, or hot drafts that might lead to Vietnam. You know? That's what we produced. We produced people who were essentially hedonists, pleasure seekers, opportunists who would do anything to get in the mainstream, to get the brass ring on the mainstream sewer ride. And you wondered why they were so easily brainwashed? You had people changing their sex every morning on campuses in the middle of the 1960s. I mean, they were changing everything. There was no morality. The popular culture was cultural relativism. Social relativism, moral relativism. They didn't study anything. They didn't learn. They didn't know anything. They wouldn't go through the experience of knowing. They would learn. They would go to the library, read a book, get a text. That's knowledge. The book's a lie. How's that knowledge? It's carnal knowledge of a book. So the problem here is you have a generation, the baby boomer generation, which includes our president. Our president's major political problem is that he's a baby boomer. If you understand the baby boomer problem and you look at every mistake, every blunder the president makes, there's no other political motive for it but his fact that he's proud of being a baby boomer. He thinks of his generation as the golden generation. It was our generation who were revived by Kennedy. Because he became president, we were revived with optimism, and that was the impetus that carried the civil rights movement forward. The civil rights movement began to die in 1964. It died because the Ford Foundation, other foundations, took over and tried to split the civil rights movement. As long as Martin was alive, Martin knew how to handle the problem. He insisted on nonviolence in the movement in order to keep under control those who wanted to use violence as a method. Those who were usually on the payroll of various foundations. Martin understood the power of love. Martin understood the power of truth. Martin understood that you had to give the African American a mission. The very poor, they were poor people mostly. They were have-nots mostly. What do you get a have-not to give? But they gave. They gave the opportunity because Martin loved them. Martin gave them identity. Martin made them angels who were coming through a slum, a dump, into a place where people were rallying and said, we have a mission. We are going to change this nation into what it must become. That was Martin. Love. Now there are two lessons to be learned from that. One is the baby boomer won't admit it, but the baby boomer is a miserable creature. And their children are more miserable than they are. The baby boomer is a miserable existentialist stuck in a swamp of history. The Generation Xer doesn't know where the swamp is located. They're miserable people. They have nothing. They have no happiness. They have no joy. They have no beauty. What do they look at? Sex, violence, gore. That's their entertainment, pleasure, sadomasochistic hedonism. They don't have happiness. How do you deal with the people like that? My recipe is you have to love them. And you have to say, well, Christ had to deal with some pretty bad characters himself, didn't he? And the only solution is you have to love them. And you have to bring them to an understanding of happiness. And you have to use the shock when everything in which they thought they believed, all this paper mache, all this glitter, all this all-night techno dancing, whatever else it is, it doesn't work anymore. The lights go off for the techno joint because the power is shut off. And they have to bring in a substitute act, this Madeleine Albright. Fortunately, she has the decency to keep her clothes on. Or they'd all pass out. Huh? In any case, so that's the point. Yes, we can reach these guys, but you have to have, first number, you have to understand these are human beings. They're not in very good condition. The crate was opened. The contents were heavily contaminated. They were delivered at your door in terrible condition. They stank. They hadn't been bathed in a long time, but they're yours. And the first thing you have to do is you have to give them some motivation. And the motivation is not money. The motivation is not pleasure. They've had too much of that. The motivation is happiness. The motivation is the joy of a childlike joy in making a discovery which is an act of cognition, which gives them a sense of beauty. Drama, classical art forms, science, teach them. Give them a sense of joy. Give them a sense that it is important to be themselves, that there's something beautiful inside them. People will not fight in this time for money. They won't fight for this objective. They're not going to fight for this practical program, that practical program, because they're draft dodgers. They don't fight. They steal, but they don't fight. Huh? What you have to do is give them human character by evoking it from within them, awakening it. And that's what we have to do. You have to love them. But to love a person is not the kind of tough love they talk about at the IMF, but the other kind. We don't put up with any nonsense. But we want the best for you. And that'll work. So what do you live for? Do you live like an animal? To go out with a whimper? Or do you live like a human being, knowing that you are doing something, you are developing in yourself, something which will be transmitted to future generations to make humanity better in the future? You no longer are a little person living in a little neighborhood with a little mind, with little ambitions and little interests. You suddenly become a very big person because you have the minds of some of the greatest people in history before you live in you. in your replication of what exactly their act of discovery. You do things with pride to say, he was right. This was a great discovery. We've got to use it for mankind's benefit. You say, I've got to do something to make the future better for those who come after us. And I can die with a smile on my face. Because I've lived well. I've lived at peace with the greatest people of the past, or at least some of them. And I can live at peace with joy in the people of the future. I will live forever in this process. That's what it is to be human. And when you think like that, and look at other people like that, you don't have a problem. You may have problems, but that's fun. Because if problems force you to attack and solve problems, whether as an individual or in concert with others, that is fun. It's what the puppy does when the happy puppy is playing. The worst thing you can do to a puppy is not play with it. Make it angry. It gets bored. The worst thing you do to a horse is not play with it, not work with it. It gets bored. It's unhappy. May get sick and die on you. It has no purpose in life. Human beings have a different kind of play. It's that kind of play called cognition in respect to past and present, which makes an absolute moral difference, which defines the individual person as a creature made in the image of the Creator. When you think in those terms, then you think accordingly. Now, how do we get out of this mess? I've defined implicitly what the problem is. The problem is we are gripped by a system, a doomed system, a self-doomed system. This system, this financial monetary system, with its legal trappings such as Scalia, with its popular trappings such as popular opinion, this system, with its lack of sense of what humanity is, a lack of moral principle. There is no moral principle. If you don't have a sense of what humanity is, as I've described it, you have no morality. It's all mechanical. There's no morality in it. Morality involves passion. And passion, moral passion, is love for human beings. It's love for those who created people who went before you. It's love for those who are coming afterward. To do nothing shameful in the eyes of those who came before you, even if you disagree with them. And to do nothing which is not beneficial to the society that comes afterward. No, in Plato called this agape. The Apostle Paul referred to this repeatedly, as in 1 Corinthians 13, as agape. Don't get involved like crazy Pat Robertson or Jerry Fall with these do's and don'ts, single issues. Forget the single issues. Don't marry about a list of do's and don'ts. Paul says the same thing. This is fraud. Concentrate on agape, which is the essence of all morality. And when you have agape, you don't need any other code except good judgment. Agape essentially is knowing what a human being is, knowing what humanity is, knowing what cognition is, and loving what you have received as benefits from the past, cognitively, and loving the future by giving to the future that which the future as human needs. And if you always act according to that, you may fall short in your understanding of what you need to do, but your intentions are always clear and moral. And that's what we lack essentially. So that's the problem I face. I live in a society in which my generation was degenerate, became my degeneration. And my degeneration taught their children to degenerate still further. And now the thing is collapsing. And people are saying, "How you got to fix the system. You can't change the system. You got to fix it. Don't talk about changing the system. Why don't you come up with some suggestion that will make the system work. It's like, find a way to make strychnine enjoyable. That's the problem. What comes down to, we have a shortage of leaders. And this problem of leadership has two aspects to it. One aspect is people who are qualified to be leaders. What's a person qualified to be a leader? A person who is essentially, for what I've said here, a person of agape. A person who has passion, who has love for humanity, who wants to do good for future humanity, to honor the noble contributions of people from the past, and to give something better to the future. Those people are leaders. People who will not sell out the principle of agape for the sake of opinion or personal advantage. Will be not self-sacrificing. What they have done in the United States in particular, what has been done to the American people, and I've only indicated the surface of this, the highlights of that over the recent period. When I came out of service at the end of the war, just after, while Roosevelt's life was still in memory, living memory of many of us who served abroad, we shared the opinion, most of us, even some boys from the South, we shared the opinion that, as I would express it more articulately than most of them would at that time, but they shared it, that we had just come through a Second World War, which we were about to win. That was sure at that point. And the question was, when those of us who had served in Asia and saw the conditions of life in Asia, the oppression under colonialism of people in Asia, he said, you cannot expect to go through 2 world wars and fight them with what these have meant and ignore the great injustice to the great masses of Asia and not expect to have a 3rd World War come haunt you sometime soon down the pike. We shared that view. We said, as Americans, it is our job. I didn't know what Roosevelt's policies were at the time. I had a smell of them, but these were my policies, and policies that I think most of the people who were in service with me at the time shared. We have to ensure that this ends, that colonialism and all its trappings ends. We have the power. We will come out of this war as the victors. We will have power in our hands. We can tell the world this system of colonialism is finished. And these nations, these new nations, are going to have the right, and with our assistance, to develop in the way we would want to develop, the way they choose, but with the same right. Within about 18 months of that time, probably 95% of the people I knew in service who had shared that view with me were on the other side. A gift of Trumanism. These were the people of my generation, the returning World War II veterans. Most of them sold out and were totally corrupt. I saw it. It stunk. I hated it. I saw my friends being self-destroyed. To see one destroyed is bad, but to see a person self-destroyed is the most horrible thing. These people became opportunists. They told their children, especially those in suburbia, be careful. Be careful. The neighbors are watching. And the children became shallow-minded hypocrites who would get, on the one hand, from education, those who had better education, would get a sense of certain values were good and certain were bad. Certain things were fair, certain things were unfair. These kinds of positive values would occur. But they were very shallow. They didn't have a deep sense of morality. They didn't have a sense of putting your life on the line if necessary for a principle. You don't put your life on your line because you want to die. You put your life on the line because it's so important to you to defend and uphold a principle that you will not hesitate to risk your life to defend that principle. And that's what these little kiddos didn't get. And when they got hit, as others did, with the 1962 missile crisis, and then with the assassination of John Kennedy, most of the generation, of the children of my generation, went crazy. It was called the rock, drug, sex counterculture. You know what happened, the 68 phenomenon. As it occurred in the United States, as it occurred in Europe. These things happened. And I found myself more and more, as we got into the 60s, middle 60s, standing alone. There was nobody there to lead, not really lead. People called themselves leaders, but they were all fake. And I found myself standing alone. And I just said, I got to do something. I must do something. So I did it. And some people in the room know or had some experience with what I did. Now, I was right. The first thing, I was a good economist then, a very good one, probably the best, at least on performance. You look at the past, look at what I forecast, what I taught. I was better than anybody I know today alive from that period or even today. I was the best. So I took my skills and knowledge and I just intervened on campuses and began impromptu educating young people wherever I could find them. And out of that came a movement. I did some more forecasting. And I was right. I have never made a forecast which did not turn out exactly as I specified it. Never. I've been at forecasting actually for more than 40 years. I never made a mistake in that. Well, I was also careful. I didn't forecast if I wasn't sure. Someone says, give me a prediction. I say, no. I'll give you the ones I have. I don't make these things up, on demand. I'm not like a slot machine. You put a quarter in and get a forecast out. 71, the collapse. What happened in the late 60s? A series of monetary crises leading to a breakdown of the Bretton Woods system as it now existed, unless certain changes were made. It happened exactly that way. 1967, the British pound sterling crisis. February, March, 1968, the dollar crisis. 1970, the Penn Central and Chrysler crisis. 1971, the collapse of the entire monetary system. 1975, a new wave of this. Then came the Carter administration, which destroyed all regulation to speak of. Destroyed everything, infrastructure upon which this country was based. And we're suffering today because of a collapse of infrastructure which has been in progress for 30 years. For 30 years, the United States has had a negative investment in basic economic infrastructure, in transportation, in urban development, in power generation and distribution, in medical care, and so forth. We have been destroying ourselves as a nation over 30 years, culturally and every other way. And I found myself standing alone. I warned against Carter in a campaign I ran in 1976, and I was right. I warned against what Carter represented and what Bush represented in 1979, 1980 in that campaign, and I was right. I warned what was coming out of the degeneration of the Reagan administration in 1984 in the presidential election campaign, which changed history in this country and in the world, and I was right. 1988, I forecast the immediately following collapse of the Soviet system and outlined what had to be done about that. And I was right. But I found myself, as you know, largely standing alone, surrounded by a few friends and a few friendly souls who would agree with me. It's a terrible responsibility to stand as I do at my age and to have these responsibilities. Because if I were to be taken, I don't know what would happen to the rest of you. And I'm not talking just about the United States, I'm talking about the world. Because in this United States, I know the institutions of the United States, at least well enough to know what the story is. There isn't in the whole pack of political party leaderships, there is not the essential ingredient to save this nation. We have to inject it. And I, above all, have to inject it, which is why I'm running again. I have many people in Western Europe that I admire. They're not the large percentage of people in Western Europe, but they're a substantial number. In Germany, in Italy, a few in France, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechia, Slovakia, the Balkans, so forth. They're good people. But they are not in the situation with the kind of leadership and knowledge necessary to put this back together again. Many of them are indispensable people in the sense that they represent an indispensable part of any combination which would put this thing into shape. But without my participation, they wouldn't make it. And therefore, it comes to the point, as now, that sometimes upon us falls the responsibility of leadership. It happens to all of us in some way or another, or many of us. Every physician will face that, because every sick person is a different person with a different disease, no matter what the diagnosis is. And the physician has to face the responsibility of dealing with that problem. A great teacher teaching a class of students faces the same thing about saving these young minds, a responsibility for saving them. Under these conditions today, it's a great, awesome responsibility. For some of us, the responsibility of the same singular variety comes in a different way, each in a different way. But to all of us, one thing is in common. When destiny has given you a vocation, and you have a mission, especially when you're the only one to play a key part in realizing that mission, you better accept it and do it. Thank you.